Imagine finding a forgotten bowl of fruit on the kitchen counter. It has gone soft, started leaking, and developed the atmosphere of a small crime scene. You would probably throw it away. An ancient primate may have looked at the same situation and thought, free lunch. So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? The honest answer comes in three parts. Our ancestors may have encountered naturally fermented fruit millions of years ago. Humans were probably making alcohol deliberately at least 13,000 years ago, and we have strong chemical evidence for carefully prepared fermented drinks from about 9,000 years ago. The difficult part is that the first drink left no receipt. Alcohol does not require a brewery, a bottle, or someone with a complicated opinion about hops. It can appear whenever yeast gets access to sugar. Yeast consumes the sugar and produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. Humans eventually learned to control this process, but nature was doing it first. A ripe fruit is already a small container full of water and sugar. If its skin breaks, yeast from the environment can get inside. Leave the fruit somewhere warm and it may begin fermenting. The result is not a fine vintage. It is more like fruit soup prepared by the ground. But it can contain alcohol. This means the story begins long before farms, pottery, or our own species. A study of an alcohol processing enzyme called ADH4 suggested that an ancestor shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas became much better at metabolizing ethanol around 10 million years ago. That was millions of years before Homo sapiens appeared. The researchers reconstructed ancient versions of the enzyme and found that a genetic change greatly improved its ability to process ethanol. One possible explanation is that some of our ancestors were spending more time on the ground, where fallen fruit was more likely to be bruised, overripe, and fermenting. This does not prove that prehistoric apes were holding tiny parties beneath the trees. It suggests that alcohol had become common enough in their food to matter biologically. Being able to eat a slightly fermented fig without immediately becoming useless may have been an advantage. Alcohol, in other words, was not invented by humans. It was discovered in the same way many important things are discovered. Something was left unattended. At some point, our ancestors moved from finding fermented food to making it happen on purpose. That step is much harder to date. A person could crush fruit into an animal skin, wooden bowl, gourd, or basket lined with something waterproof. Almost none of those containers would survive for archaeologists to inspect thousands of years later. If bad drawings and good explanations are your preferred fermentation vessel, subscribe and we will continue leaving ideas in jars until something useful happens. The earliest surviving clue to deliberate brewing may come from Raqefet Cave in what is now Israel. About 13,000 years ago, people from the Natufian culture used the cave as a burial place. Researchers examined stone mortars found there and identified plant residues and damaged starch grains consistent with malting, heating, and fermenting wild cereals. The proposed process was surprisingly involved. Seeds could be germinated to produce malt, crushed, mixed with water, heated, and then allowed to ferment. That is not fruit accidentally becoming suspicious behind a rock. It is a recipe. The resulting drink probably did not resemble a clear modern lager. It may have been cloudy, thick, and closer to a drinkable porridge. You would not hold it toward the light and discuss its delicate finish. You might need to chew. The mortars were associated with burials, so the researcher suggested that this beer-like drink was used during ritual feasts. If that interpretation is correct, people were brewing before domesticated cereal farming had fully developed in the region. There is some scholarly disagreement about exactly what the residues prove. Ancient starch is not a written label saying, "Definitely beer, please refrigerate." So Raqefet is best described as very early evidence consistent with deliberate cereal brewing, not a perfectly preserved prehistoric pub. Clearer chemical evidence appears several thousand years later at Jiahu, a Neolithic village in what is now Henan Province, China. Pottery vessels dating to roughly 7,000 to 6,600 BC contained residues from a fermented mixture of rice, honey, and fruit, probably hawthorn fruit or wild grapes. That drink is difficult to place in a modern category. It was partly rice beverage, partly mead, and partly fruit wine. Apparently, nobody had yet invented the person who says those should never be mixed. But the important thing is control. People were selecting ingredients, placing them in pottery, and allowing fermentation to occur. The jar had become a managed little ecosystem. Sugar went in. Yeast did its invisible work. A socially interesting liquid came out. Later evidence shows grape wine in large pottery jars in what is now Georgia by around 6,000 to 5,800 BC. Wine residues also appear at sites in Iran. Beer became deeply connected with societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where grain agriculture made it possible to produce fermented drinks on a much larger scale. This has encouraged a famous idea that humans may have adopted farming partly because they wanted beer. The evidence does show that brewing and cereal processing were important very early. It does not prove that agriculture was invented because someone wanted a reliable drink on Friday. Farming had many possible advantages. Grain could be stored, cooked, traded, and used to feed larger communities. Beer may have been one incentive among several. It turned grain into something flavorful, calorie-containing, and useful at gatherings. It also required people to remain in one place long enough to grow, harvest, process, and store ingredients. Once communities became more settled, alcohol gained jobs. It could be part of a feast, funeral, offering, payment, celebration, negotiation, or ordinary meal. Sharing a fermented drink created a reason to gather and a way to display generosity. A large jar of beer said, "I have surplus grain and would like everyone to notice," calmly. Fermentation also changes flavor and can make some ingredients easier to consume. But we should be careful with the popular claim that ancient people drank alcohol because water was always unsafe. Water quality varied enormously by place and time, and ancient people were perfectly capable of finding springs, wells, and other usable sources. Alcohol was not simply prehistoric bottled water with worse decision-making. Early drinks were also generally produced by fermentation alone. Distillation, which allows much stronger spirits, came far later. The first alcoholic beverages were probably modest, variable, and often full of floating material. A modern bottle is a highly controlled product. Ancient fermentation was more like inviting microorganisms into a container and hoping the polite ones arrived first. So, what counts as the beginning? If we mean the first time one of our distant ancestors consumed ethanol, the answer may be more than 10 million years ago, with fermented fruit on the forest floor. If we mean deliberate brewing, the archaeological trail reaches back about 13,000 years, although that evidence is debated. If we want strong chemical evidence from containers, Jiahu gives us a carefully made fermented drink from about 9,000 years ago, and even that was almost certainly not the true first batch. Archaeology gives us the oldest evidence that survived, not the oldest event that happened. Countless earlier experiments may have vanished with the gourds, skins, baskets, fruit pulp, and unfortunate facial expressions that contained them. The main invention was not alcohol itself. Yeast had already handled that. The human invention was the container and the decision to wait. Someone noticed that sweet food changed when it sat for a while. Then they tried to make the change happen again. A lucky accident became a method. The method became a recipe. The recipe became part of rituals, farming, trade, religion, and ordinary social life. Which means the glass on a modern table is the latest version of one very old object, A small pool of sugar, guarded for a while invisible organisms do the work. The first bar had no walls, no menu, and very poor seating. It was probably just a patch of forest floor beneath some overripe fruit. And one of our ancestors, finding the fruit already half eaten by yeast, decided not to waste it.